Terrific. Okay, so as I said, I'm here today to sort of give an overview of what are bots and what are your mechanisms for dealing with them. This is not going to be a session where you spend the next 20 minutes looking at these slides and then you miraculously can solve all of your bot problems. It's more of what is going on to cause this activity, and then what are the tools that you and your tech teams have to deal with them. And Luke Taylor from Discovery Garden and Joe Corral from Lehigh have both are both battling the same issues that the rest of us are and have agreed to talk for a few moments at the end. And as we go along, feel free to jump in, guys, about how you're using some of these tools. And folks, at the end, we can do some Q&A, and if other folks have other tools to add or want to just talk about, tips and techniques, I think there's plenty of time for that towards the end of this. And I did link these slides in the chat. In most of these slides, there's a link down here, which is the source for whatever is in the white area, often a screenshot or an image, but those are sort of read more links if you're interested. So what are bots? Fundamentally, bots are and this is where the word crawler comes from, crawling the web, looking for public content and saving some or some of it for whatever the purpose the bot was built for was. And the way this works is these various crawlers are set up to build the search engines that we use every day, and more they are now being built to build these AI engines. There are a number of very public AI engines, but then there's a lot of very private AI engines as well. And the result is that the amount of crawler traffic, and especially the amount of crawler traffic that isn't quote unquote playing by the rules, has gone up tremendously in the last couple of years. So what does it mean to play by the rules? I don't know when this started, probably close to 20 years ago now, maybe 25 even. This sort of standard for robots.txt was created, whereby this one file, robots.txt, would go in the root of your website, and it would contain a set of rules that would describe to bots what they were allowed to do on your site. So you can disallow certain pages or types of pages, and then you can determine, or you can try to determine, you can prescribe which user agents have access, and even how often they're allowed to access your site. But all of this is just an ask, right? You're setting out some rules, and then it's up to the various crawlers to decide whether or not they're following these rules. So something like Google is heavily invested in following these rules for its search engine crawler, but as many of you have experienced, there are plenty of other crawlers out there now who don't have a public persona to protect, and they don't really care about what you think they should do with your site. A couple of notes here about robots.txt. You can update it. So if you realize that your current robots.txt is inadequate, or you want to change some of those rules, you can change it, but most crawlers don't look at that file every time they come to your site. Most are on some sort of a caching schedule, and they'll essentially like do their big batch job, and then they will check your robots.txt the next time the next batch starts, or some variation of that sort of logic. So don't expect, if you change your robots.txt file, even that the well-behaved bots will immediately start following the new rules. The second thing, because we're in the Drupal ecosystem, is that if you just run Composer in the way that the Drupal site template tells you to run Composer, more than likely you will not have a robots.txt. If you visit your domain / robots.txt, you can tell whether you do. And Luke added this note here on the left. There is this project robots.txt that will slip the robots.txt file back in there. There are other mechanisms to do this. You can do it right in Composer. Drupal provides you with a recommended robots.txt. So the first thing you should do is to ensure that the crawlers that are following the rules have rules to follow. So make sure your site has a robots.txt and then add this module or change how your Composer uh, rules work if you do not, so that you have a good one. And then read up on what you can do with it and set some good rules. Okay, so what are bad bots or bad actors? Um, there are a variety of bots which are just known to not follow the rules, or sometimes simply you don't really support what they're trying to do with your data. And for any reason, you might decide to ban a bot. Now you notice back in this example here, this said user agent star. This will allow any user agent. You can specify in your robots.txt that you don't want certain crawlers to crawl your site. Some of these will follow those rules, and some of these you have to find another way to block. Another thing that another term that sort of gets thrown around a bunch is a DDoS or distributed denial of service attack. Um, a true DDoS is a malicious action, right? Somebody wants your site to be inaccessible to the general internet, is basically the main use case for it. And so they send their bot network after your site, and they just are pushing so much traffic at your site that your site cannot deliver to the real humans who are trying to use it in a performant way. There are lots of mechanisms for protecting against this, but oftentimes, if you're dealing with this, especially the new AI bot traffic, you're going to feel like you're under a DDoS attack. Um, Most of the time, you're not, unless you have some very controversial content. Um, it's more likely somebody is trying to harvest your content for their own commercial purposes. So you can imagine that the AI engines really take an enormous amount of data to train well. And some of these engines are new. Some of them are, um, a lot of these companies are reinventing the wheel, and a lot of them, there may well be bugs in their crawlers. So this is an example from this company called Read the Docs, where they had, before they caught it, 73 terabytes of traffic from a single bot. It cost them $5,000. And this was actually a relatively well-behaved bot. They got in touch with this company, and they were, as of the writing of the link in the bottom left corner, that company had offered to pay for that excess of bandwidth. But this is not the usual situation. There's just an enormous amount of this bot traffic out there as a result of building these complex engines. And sometimes, even when the bots think they're playing by the rules, they're not. And and again, a lot of them aren't trying to play by the rules either. So we talked about user agents. Obviously, the first thing you might do is ban some user agents. Um, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but you can, in your Nginx or Apache layer, just look at that user agent in the request and throw a 404 or a 503 response instead of returning the actual page for a user agent. So what do the bots do? They spoof a real user agent. They'll say they're Firefox on a iPad, you know. They'll try to be as human looking as possible so that so that you can't block them with a simple mechanism like I don't want to talk to the SEMrush bot. we're not the only ones dealing with this problem. It's worth noting that this is a huge problem in advertising, where people are paying by the impression, um, not so much when they're paying by the click, but really by the impression. Where if you send a bot network after a site to generate a lot of fake traffic, you can run up folks' advertising bills pretty quickly. And as the advertiser, you can feel like you're getting nothing of value, that really all you're doing is showing ads to bots. So there's a lot of different groups are working on this same problem from different angles. So how do you block a spoofed user agent? There's actually a lot of other mechanisms beyond the user agent string. You can look at whether the the request has JavaScript capabilities. You can sometimes see what the screen resolution is for the request. And there's just a lot. If you actually poke at the request headers, sometimes you can do a lot with that, and you can uh, wave off a certain amount of that traffic. Um, but you're starting to see this gets pretty tedious if you're trying to do this yourself, right? You're building pretty complex models of what it is to be real traffic versus not real traffic. And for most of us who just want to, focus on the content management, say, rather than focus on defending our sites against bots, this is not something we want to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Um, so even a really well spoofed request, often though will be coming from a cluster of IP addresses. So that is actually a pretty effective mechanism a lot of times for identifying uh, activity that you're not interested in uh, responding to with real responses. So the Tencent, which is a company in China which runs one of these really big AI crawlers. If you take the IP address that the request is coming from, a lot of times you can trace it back with one of these tools like IP2 location to see where it's coming from. And then, this one identifies itself directly as Tencent, and you can decide just to block this IP address. Now, Tencent is an enormous corporation, right? And so they've got many data centers, and you could spend your whole life finding IP addresses from them and banning them. So again, this is not something that any of us want to do manually. But sometimes it's the best defense when your site is running hot and you need to just bring the traffic level down to where your regular human users can use it again, to go and analyze the logs for 5 minutes or 2 hours, and then to throw in some new IP blocks. So we'll talk about some tools that you can do that in a little bit. Okay. Um, so where can you do this? There's a number of different levels. So moving outward from Islandora, from your website in the middle, the first level is that robots.txt. But again, that's not going to protect you from the bad actors. So the next level out would be the Nginx or Apache layer, where your web server is looking at requests and deciding whether or not to respond to them. Another level out from there is some sort of web application firewall or a network firewall, where your network is actually, or an appliance in your network is reviewing the requests before it gets passed off to your web server. So some of you in institutional data centers may have this from your institution. And if you're in a cloud hosting provider like Amazon, there are, we'll talk about it in a few minutes, but there are web application firewalls you can put in front of all of the services that you're running in AWS. And that's true for Azure and all the other providers as well. The next layer out, I would say, and gets hand wavy from here, because there are a lot of different options. But the next option I was thinking we should highlight are content delivery networks, CDNs. A CDN You can think of it as a distributed cache. So it can do the responding to certain things from your site that don't change, like CSS files and JavaScript files, and even anonymous traffic to frequently requested pages. All can be delivered by a CDN, and those requests don't get to your server, or not as often. And then outside of that, there is this DNS layer. Um, and this is sort of that's as far as my expertise in this goes. But at the DNS layer, similar to how the network can look at the request, even when you make that initial request to the DNS for a DNS lookup, you can start the profiling of, is this a bot or is this not a bot? And you actually can get some very effective uh, bot blocking sort of behavior if you combine all three of the outer layers here. So some of you may have heard of a service called Cloudflare. Um, fundamentally their product is the outer three layers here. You assign all of your DNS records to them, so they handle the DNS requests. Your content can be externally cached in their content delivery network, and they give you sort of WAF, well, really firewall tools to handle user agents, to set rules in their software about what actually gets passed on to your server. All right, so let's go through some of these in a little more detail. And maybe I should have done this backwards, but I'm going to work from the center outward. Uh, so assuming you've done your due diligence setting up a correct robots.txt file, the next tool that you would have is something, as I said, in the Nginx or Apache layer, probably. Um, And this tool is one that we use, and I know that others in the Islandora community use it as well. It is a relatively manual tool. You download their list of bad user agents and their starter list of bad IP addresses, and you load all of the tools into your server, and it runs. And every time a request comes in, it goes through these deny lists before it gets to your site. So if you find an IP address, that needs to be blocked, it's as simple as adding it to the list. Or if you find another crawler that's not behaving, that is identifying itself with a user agent, you can just add that user agent and block that traffic. So this isn't, I wouldn't say this should be your first level, your first action, but if none of the other better options apply, you can still do this. And it works, and it'll give you a level of control. Okay, as I said, this is a screenshot of the AWS options. AWS has something they call a WAF, a web application firewall, but then they also offer this tool now called AWS Shield, which is more specifically designed for this purpose. I believe if you add a WAF to your network, to your set of services, you now get the AWS Shield alongside of it. But really, what they're doing is they're giving you a preset detection algorithm and a set of sort of standard bot rules about what to allow and what to deny. So this keeps any request that is caught in this web application firewall or this shield layer away from even getting to your website, because it has to go through, the request has to go through one of these tools before your server even considers it. And if you're running a bunch of sites, the big advantage here is that you can have the same set of rules configured in your cloud hosting provider that apply to all of these sites. But you either have to be using a cloud hosting provider, or whoever is providing your hosting for you has to be giving you a set of tools um, uh, at their network firewall level. Okay, so I mentioned Cloudflare before. Cloudflare, the original product from, I don't know, 15 years ago or something like that, was a CDN. And And they do this really, really, really well. They have data centers all over the world, and so if you kind of get into their ecosystem, they will cache content bef outside and away from your server. So the request will come essentially through their CDN network. And if their CDN network does not have the resource that's requested cached, it will go ask your server for it. And it will come back with a time to live instruction on it, and it will cache that at the CDN level as close to the end user as possible for as long as you're allowing. So you have some level of control. It does potentially reduce your server load tremendously, um, but it really works the best for static assets, or if you're willing to consider your site to be pretty static. So if you run a search and you cache the result of the search, uh, let's say I'm in Florida and I do that, and somebody adds a piece of content, and then a request comes in from the West Coast, the person on the West Coast may get a different result set than the cached result in Florida because it's doing this geographic content delivery network distribution. So you have to be willing to deal with vagaries like that in terms of what people see when they look at your site. But for the most part, when the sites that we all run are tolerant of that. Okay. As I mentioned, Cloudflare goes well beyond that now. So now Cloudflare really starts at that DNS level, and you can really only get the massive benefits of Cloudflare, which does handle the vast majority of all the things we've talked about here today, if you move your name servers um, to their DNS tools. You can do smaller versions of some of these things. And Joe will talk a little bit about Turnstile, which is a smaller version of part of their toolkit in a few moments. But if you want the full stack from them, you need to do the DNS assignment. In AWS, there are a set of tools, two or three tools that can give you a similar set of tools. Like you can emulate what Cloudflare is doing inside of AWS or inside of Azure by putting together a couple of services from those providers. And you can mix and match as well. You don't have to go all the way to DNS. You can slide in a WAF or some, their bot shield or what have you without doing everything. So I would say the Cloudflare option is the best, but you have to control your DNS records, right? And so if your institution may have made this decision for you, like I believe Amy Whitman College name servers are with Cloudflare, and so you have that protection ahead of the site because that's how it's configured over there. But many of our other clients do not do that, and so the Cloudflare is not an effective option for us at the level of all of these tools all at once. All right, Joe, do you want to talk a little bit about the Turnstile project?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I recently came out with this new option. Turnstile Protect is the name of the module. There's a link there in the slide. We ended up enabling this at Lehigh. Just as I'm sure everyone else is seeing, we're getting large swaths of bots hitting us from large swaths of network IPs and spoofing their user agents. And so that we were largely getting mitigated by like individual rate limiters, but we still were seeing heavy load on our server just because of the distributed nature of these bots. So we ended up enabling this turnstile protection it's in front of our collection pages and in front of our search index. What it basically does is it's looking at all the traffic that's coming through to the website, and it's looking at it in the range. So it's looking at it ends up being like 65,000 IPs get caught in this range, and there's many ranges, but so that's like a one bucket. And so in that bucket, if we see more than I just set the limit very low to 20. So in a day, if 20 different visits come from that IP range, we challenge individual clients then that are coming from that range with a turnstile there, which Cloudflare offers for free. It's similar to a reCAPTCHA, the benefits being it's more privacy focused where they don't resell your data. And it's you don't have to click usually. Most of the time, Cloudflare is intelligent enough to be able to decipher if you're a human visitor or a robot. And so all the traffic's still coming to our server to sort of do this behavior, but it has so far we've only had it in production about a week. It's significantly reduced the load just because it's not having to do those search indexes that previously these bots were just like slamming our search index. So it avoids that from happening. You still do need to deal with that traffic, but we can see like a significant reduction. So far, so good. Um, yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And that matches our experience as well. The vast, like we get traffic to any number of pages, but the worst traffic are unique Solr queries that the server has never seen before, especially when there's like dozens and dozens of URL parameters stacked on end of each other. Um, so just protecting those URLs makes a lot of sense that would reduce that traffic. We're looking forward to testing this, but haven't got it to production yet. Luke, are you here? Do you want to speak to any tools that you use?
I don't see Luke in the list of participants, so he might not have been able to make it.
Okay, I think he added this slide. Um, Luke's thoughts that he shared privately with me really were that if you can access a CDN or a WAF sort of a tool, you should be doing that first, right? All the tools that we talk about that were setting configurations inside of your web hoster, your web application, um, really that is a fallback for if you do not have one of these, the like broader tools available to you. And for the most part, from my perspective, you wouldn't because either you're in an institutional data center and you don't have the ability to add, an AWS service or an Azure service in front of other services you're already running, or if you can't move your DNS records, right? You can't change lehigh.edu, so that's not a tool that you have available to you. But if you can, if you're running for a private institution who is willing to consider moving their DNS records to Cloudflare, that definitely buys you an enormous amount of protection. And Luke's linked a couple things here. Oh, he mentioned CrowdSec also. So remember I was talking about how you can be analyzing this traffic yourself and setting these rules. CrowdSec is a tool that kind of does that for you, right? You install this agent on the server and it will watch the traffic in real time and look for patterns and ban things that are, potentially negative patterns. Now, I say potentially because it could be like somebody is running a class from an offsite location, and suddenly you have a whole bunch of students all doing exactly the same thing in your search results all at the same time, and they could get blocked by an automated tool like this. They could get blocked by any number of these tools, but that's kind of what you're up against. The thing that Joe demoed is really cool because um, even if you trip the trigger for this is like suspicious activity, it then challenges the user. And if it's a real browser, which is what that little box that says, "Are you a human?" Is trying to detect, if that comes back true, then it just lets that traffic through the way it normally would after that. It's identified that IP as a benevolent one, and it will allow the traffic subject to whatever rules you have going on. Like you may have rate limits also on top of that. Fail to ban is another one where it is looking for patterns in requests. In the old days, we used that for SSH protection on servers, and maybe it does web stuff as well now. So again, I'm not here to say, do this or do that and all of your problems will be solved, but I wanted to um, give folks a rundown on what tools and techniques are out there and then open up the floor to um, questions, concerns, tips, tricks, whatever folks want to talk about.
And I'd just like to add, great demo or you know, overview here, Noah. I just wanted to give a little bit of color, like why we decided not to go with like putting Cloudflare completely in front of our site. We technically could, but we just felt like there's a risk there where, yes, it is going to do a much better job of keeping the server load down, and it's probably going to catch things in a much more sophisticated way than this turnstile protect approach. But there is a risk there with cost where you're kind of your costs. I'm not completely familiar with Cloudflare's pricing, but I know in general CDNs typically charge by like request, and that's something that's sort of not in your control. So I feel like caught like being able to mitigate your costs there. I feel like there's a risk there that um, basically with this approach, it's free rather than something where the cost could get out of control possibly. So that just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, definitely. Any auto scaling sort of technique like that. Other folks using other tools? Have other folks tried some of these tools? Rob, do you want to speak to this notion of gray listing? Oh, no worries. So in the chat, Rob has mentioned a concept of gray listing, which is sort of it's not it's not an all or nothing technique. It's sort of where if like I was describing for turnstile, rather than denying a suspicious request, you just slow it down, right? You say, yeah, I'll give you that back, but in 5 seconds or something like that. And so you can slow the suspicious traffic. It's definitely a tried and true technique, but it's probably something that needs to be combined with other techniques here.
Yeah, I'd be curious what the resources to do something like that would require. It feels like there'd be maybe some queuing, potentially some queuing problems with that. I don't
Yeah.
know. Interesting to look into though.
Rebel, any blocking anyone blocking entire geolocations? Like, yeah, sometimes when we get fed up with certain IP blocks, we will just block, a slash 16 or something just to cut down the traffic. We did that accidentally. An entire Bell Internet Canada could not get to a couple of sites that we had. So you got to be careful with that because those IP ranges get big fast. You don't want to accidentally block something that's wider than you want to. Amy adds, we tried toggling on the Cloudflare bot blocker. Um, yeah, so that this link that you've included here, this is Cloudflare has a number of propaganda links about this same sort of thing. And that's their promise, right? You enable this and they do all of the fancy stuff behind the scenes. Um, it's an appealing promise. And you really have to, but it's really not one click, right? You can turn this thing on, but then really you need to go in and configure it because either it's going to be too light or it's going to be too heavy, and you're going to need to continue to configure it.
And I just left a comment to that point where we've had to toy with like what is too tight and what is too loose. Because I've been blocked myself from my own site because of my own work on, the repository.
Yep, absolutely. Mike Sharp mentions just add friction. Oh, that was about the gray listing or something similar to that. Um,
Yeah, we're using AWS as our kind of hosting. So we're using the WAF rules, and just adding a challenge response has helped for us. It's not perfect. And yeah, as everybody knows, Tencent comes from that smear of IP addresses. So it may not be technically a DDoS, but it sure feels like it.
Yep, absolutely. And Brian, you say you're working with Central IT on a WAF in front of I7. Um, yeah, right. This is not just related only to Islandora 2.0. This is a problem for anybody who has a significant amount of interesting content. And these digital collections that we all run are very interesting to AI bots.
Yeah, definitely. We've had a lot of hits on some of our collections. Early on in I7, we had complete what felt like denial of service attack completely to the point where restarting servers, trying to get services back online, etc. Very interruptive. Uh, Seems like an attack anyway. But yeah, we started going down around just banning IPs and initially, and then finding out that won't get you everywhere. You ban one, 10 will show up and automatically. So we reached out to our central IT, and they had a F5 WAF that we could use, or they offered it to us to use to keep our site up and protected. So we've had that in place probably for about a year and a half, 2 years now. So we're doing fairly well with it. Well, actually, probably even a little bit longer than that. Um, but it's been great for us with regards to, we haven't had to bounce the systems constantly. We can have the site up and running. The positive side is if you do get hit a site or whatever, it gives you a code that you can actually report back to us, and we can then have that sent back to our central IT that can find out exactly what the path was or what they were trying to do, and then write a rule to allow that if needed, and things along those lines. So yeah, I give a thumbs up for the WAF side of it.
Definitely. And Seth mentions the CloudFront CDN. That's one of those services AWS offers that you can sort of slide into your stack and act in that way to intercept requests and cache them above your server. Rebel, yeah, I mean, if the AI bots followed the rules in the robots.txt, then that would be great. I will say that there are a lot of hosting providers now that do give you sort of a button. Like if you're building commercial websites and you're on um, WordPress.org or something, there is a button in there that says disallow AI bots. And what they're doing is essentially either applying a bunch of these techniques we've talked about today or not, depending on whether you have that option checked. It's a really difficult problem. And it's the spoofing element of it is the problem, right? People are not following the rules, and they're actively trying to get around the protections that you put in place.
I was going to add, I don't think we mentioned, Rob had commented back when Rebel asked in the chat if anyone was blocking entire geolocations. Robin said they block AWS and MS Azure since almost all botnets leverage spun up cloud resources and almost no legitimate users come from there. And that seemed like a really useful thing to mention.
Thank you. I missed that. Yep. Yep. That's a really important point because there's not that many real humans sitting inside of data centers.
Yeah, until the BingBot folks complain to your boss that they're being blocked.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and that's really the challenge, right? You could lock this stuff down really, really tightly, but then like what are we doing this all for, right? We're trying to enhance research timelines and further preservation of human knowledge, and blocking all automated traffic there is not necessarily what we want. We want the legitimate crawlers to come through and use the content for legitimate purposes. That's sort of in the mission.
And that's the difficult thing because
Yep.
the bad guys are trying to look like the legitimate stuff.
Yep.
Hello, everyone. I, for
Hey.
some reason, thought this was at 2 o'clock my time, so I got my calendar mixed up.
No worries. Did you want to, let's see, I talked about the slide that you slipped in, but did you want to, you want to just give a couple notes on this?
Sure. So as would have already been mentioned, we generally strongly recommend a CDN or WAF. It's much better to stop the bad traffic before it actually gets to your host. With that being said, we have some people that are unable to use a WAF and they don't have strong control over their DNS, so they're unable to point their DNS at Cloudflare. We've had some pretty good luck with CrowdSec. It's really easy to set up. They have available apt and yum packages available to set up, and you can set up different bouncers for it that work with different services. So if you want it just to work on your host, there's a bouncer for IP tables. So if there's anything that the community that contributes to that finds, it will block them, and it'll block them through IP tables. So if you are running like on a local like on your just from your host, I'd recommend checking it out. It's super easy to set up. And basically it has a whole community around it supporting it.
I think the concerns that's raised there is often just adding a little latency going out to a third party. Have you noticed that at all, Luke? Or
No, nothing like that. It like would pull in whatever definitions it needs. That from what I can see, I haven't noticed any latency or issues around it.
great.
I mean, with that, we also have used the bad bot blocker. Have had pretty good success with that, and we also make use of fail to ban to block out. Uh, we use it to block specific ports. We've been using it with our handle server. So we say like if there's so many hits in the access log for the handle server, it will block them. So we've had pretty good luck with that as well. So you can have fail to ban basically automatically blocks traffic if somebody's hitting something excessively. You can configure how many hits would be tolerable before you would block them. So we've noticed at times like something might find a handle server, let's say, and it starts hitting the port. Then we would so instead we use fail to ban to basically block excessive hits against it.
Yep.
And then you could basically with it, you could set the ban time for how long you want it to actually be in the blocked for. But yeah, so these are the host-based controls. Or other, I definitely recommend like Cloudflare or one of the combination of a CDN and a WAF. So like we use AWS WAF ourselves and CloudFront. And I mean, there's not both Cloudflare and that approach are quite effective. I think the big thing is just if you have all of your infrastructure's code in AWS, it might make sense just to use the AWS WAF and CloudFront just because you're basically controlling it all from one spot. However, if you just have a single server and you have control over your DNS, then you'd want to have it point at Cloudflare. With that, you'd also want to make sure that you configure your firewall so you're only accepting traffic from Cloudflare because otherwise people would still find your IP address not going through DNS.
Thank you.
Yep. Anybody have any questions on my slide?
Yeah, other questions or things folks want to share? And he's linking to CrowdSec Docker Compose module. Yep.
I heard I've heard people talk about this from a
a different angle, I guess, of just adding more resources to be able to handle more traffic. Is that realistic in kind of this newer environment we're in with so many bots or and all these AI bots and things?
Ideally, you'd be stopping the bots that really aren't your end users or a friendly search crawler that you want to hit your site. You can like have it so they can scale. So we use EKS. So we have all our containers running in EKS, and it basically would just spin up more nodes as the traffic gets heavy. But that gets expensive. So ideally, and it's not really helping anybody. So ideally, you'd be stopping the traffic you don't want before it ever gets near your servers.
And you're always going to have like a central choke point. So like maybe your MySQL server, unless you're sharding that, then that gets into even more like difficulty in terms of management. So like Luke said, it's best to try to block the bots as well as you can. But yeah, you can scale. It's definitely would help.
I mean, some sites are just naturally busy if they're very large and they have, a huge amount of data. You're going to have a lot more end users finding the site and surfing it. So there is legitimate traffic that could lead to increased load as well. In a lot of cases where it's like sporadic, very high usage, it's usually bots. And I appreciated Noah's slide there with some of the most nefarious ones. I recognized all those when we were going through the slides.
Yep. All right. I think that's the main topic for today. Unless there's other Q&A on this, I stop screen sharing and pass it back. Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Noah.
Thanks very much. I'll also point out, we did have a notice on the Islandora mailing list the other day from Aaron Griffith at Lyrasis that the Fedora community is doing an information session related to AI bots on Monday, November 4th. So if you want to check in your email or on the Slack and the mailing list channel, if this has just whetted your appetite and you want to hear more about what more people are doing in other places that are sort of open source repository communities, I wanted to share that with folks as well, that's an event coming up related to this topic.
I just want to add on to that we have had some previous discussions within the Fedora governance group about this topic, and we're bringing it to the broader group. But from what the discussions we've had to date is that Fedora itself has not been an issue. It's been what lies on top of Fedora that's being hit first. So we're hoping this discussion will not be Fedora. It won't be Fedora centric. We'll be talking about the broader array of systems that we have that are sitting on top of Fedora and the issues they're dealing with.
Thanks for clarifying that, Nicole. That's great. I think at this point we're up to our open Q&A session, so I'm going to stop the recording